you can't necessarily get to any conclusion. I flattened that. I decided to end that. You see what I mean? I decided to build something that can literally disclose all of the spiritual mysteries in 99 languages. You see what I mean? So at the end of the day, I'm unapologetic. And I personally feel like that for sure, if we're not getting back to the family, we're doomed. Right? So when I look at all of life right now, I find that men are missing from the home and women generally are missing from the home because they need to make money. And all of it is starting to come down to money. And now time is money. That's why when you go to work, you work an hour, they pay you for that hour, or you work 80 or whatever, they pay you for that time. So now they've made your time equivalent to your money, and you believe it. So technically the only way to reverse that kind of equation is to get the person time back. So what I often see is things that take hours. Like, I'm from the old school. We used to spend maybe an hour and a half, almost 2 hours creating a thumbnail for a YouTube video. Why? I knew the delivery is fire.
Yeah.
But if nobody watches it because it's got that cheesy ass thumbnail, all that great. So I got to spend the time on doing that too. Now I got stuff in the CASHAPP. So all that time is back. I don't know how much that would have cost in the future, right? Also, sometimes I have to write policy, right? Sometimes somebody got to get served even. Like, you have to put some letter together, and I just sit down and type all that. Like 1 hour later trying to make sure you you don't hurt the person's feelings, but you also let them know that you're serious. That's a hell of a line.
Definitely.
This thing does it right away and make sure that I don't just send it, I read it, but I cut down time. And guess where that time goes back? It goes to my daughter. It goes to this community and the things that AI can't do, which is a lot. But that's what I'm saying. You got to weigh everything that you're doing, and you got to realize, is this becoming a habit? Is this disabling you, or is it enabling you? That's a simple thing. And I would actually recommend that people do that about everything generally that they're saying, hey, stay away from this, because they told me before, stay out of other books, only read the Bible. And we started there. You know what I mean? And hey, that's all I got to say about it.
I want to ask you next. I want to ask you, Sevan, about you talked and like I said, there's just so many directions I could go on this. I mean, bro, you went in tonight. I could go in 1,000 different directions, but in the earlier part of today's talk, you were talking about the water beings, and you were talking about the sky and the ocean being a mirror to the sky. What I want to ask you about is, in terms of a lot of people look to the sky for answers and for entities, and they think the answer's in the sky. But I want to ask you about this. Let me put this on the screen. Hold up. Give me 1 second, family.
Okay.
If there's entities underwater and we got our data underwater, just like our routers in our home disrupt us, cause certain frequencies in our homes and do certain things to us, what are these cables that we have? And I think they said it spans 750,000 miles as of 2021. What is these cables, the data in the ocean where these entities reside? What is it doing to these entities? Are they learning more about us? Are they interrupted? Is it causing them sickness? What will happen the more wires we put in the ocean where these civilizations and entities reside?
Well, first of all, nothing is put down there without ordination. Don't get it confused. And most of this stuff is sitting on that first layer that I was telling you about, because when I say the deep, we're talking about really deep, right? As far as where the mother and the ancestors and those forms are, right? Because the deeper you go, the consistency of the water is different, and it becomes what we call living waters,
right?
Okay, and that means that you can drop anything into it and it will start germinating.
Right.
So these particular lines, which is fiber optics, because we need to understand what kind of system is this. This is fiber optic, right? And so in fiber optics, you have light moving through a cable. And they talk about how that this cable, which is no thicker than a strand of hair, can pretty much carry the whole conversation, one of them, from the whole conversation, if everybody was talking from the US to
Mhm.
everybody that's talking in China down that one line, so we can get an understanding of bandwidth here. And what I like to look at, rather than, maybe even, just the pinnings of what they've done here with trying to create this network, is just the awareness that you can see already that light down a strand as thin as your hair can carry quite a bit of data.
Mhm.
So when we think about like the stars, what we're actually seeing is why many people are influenced by these celestial bodies. But technically, the data itself is not in the ocean. It's actually buried in the earth, because all of the servers that hold all the data, this is the communication, the servers that hold all the data are in the earth. So this system, as above, so below, in relation to the stars, I feel like gives the opportunity for the powers, if you may, to be able to project false lights, basically to be able to create emissions or celestial frequencies that can disrupt a person's thoughts and disrupt a person's channel. And it's almost like, I look at this more of like the dream world, right? Because all this is just threads and cables, and that's all that you see. When you basically go into these planes, you feel like, it feels like that everybody is like, in a sense, a spider, and that they have a thread that is constantly going behind them. Kind of the same way that when you see astronauts, quote unquote, they always have this tube hooked
Yeah.
onto them, like they can't have anything else that is powering them. They always have the tube there because it's symbolic to the umbilical cord. But this is also like on a spiritual level. When you go to your dream,
Mhm.
you're running down that line. They used to call it the silver line. That's why it's like a spider, because it's really like a silver spider thread, right? So you're running with that line behind you, right? And you're entering into these other realities and these other threads. And that could be potentially what this type of stuff does, because what I know for sure, and I could just tell you what I know, I don't like making things up, that when you actually at all, I'm 100% truther, right? So when you go to sleep, any water body that is around you, i.e. a river, your spirit is going to find its way to that river. Then it's going to take the flow of the river. The river eventually gets to the ocean.
Right.
So generally, once you get into that, if you can imagine that most of these cables are lying on the, all their vibrations and all that is basically inside of that water. This is why they even say, man, it can happen in the shower, that because how water works, and that we're breathing in water right now.
Yeah.
Like, that's another thing I had to highlight for folks, is like, look, like, even though like Jason talks about archaics, he's talking about the vapor canopy, which is 100% accurate. Still right now, I put a dehumidifier in here. We're about to suck a bunch of water out of the air. So technically we're in water now. We're just not in as thick as it is when you have a glass of water. But that glass of water is nowhere as thick as it is when you go down 1 league or 1 phantom.
Right.
Right? Because that's how you measure. You measure it in phantoms, right? And what are phantoms? So they're like from the past. They even call like ghosts, right? And this is how you understand that what the deep is it is all of the previous cycles. It's all stored within that water. And so these kind of systems, which are running through the seaboard and which is in this way the cheapest way. That's why it's not in the air. Like, this is the military's design. It's been up since World War I, and it's really that you can easily run a cable, especially from the back of a ship, across the entire water. Versus if you try to put this same system in the sky, even with Elon Musk's Starlink, it's going to be nowhere near as efficient and is constant. So I see a lot of I see a lot of connections with trying to create in this world, always trying to create a mimicry of what is happening on the spiritual plane. And then that way, as people become more and more or less and less, I would say less and less inclined to the spirit. Like I told you about earlier in the conversation, like, see, the spiritual inclination is natural. It's not something that somebody can separate you from and all that kind of stuff. It's not that kind of party. People who are playing with that are already on the other side. You know what I mean? Like, again, I don't consider the computer my God, but there are people who really be looking at this thing like it's going to be their next God, and they love it, right? Because it's all knowing and it doesn't talk back. And you know what I mean? So there be people on all types of trips. So it's just about like looking at the core fundamentals of things. And that's why tonight, like I explained that, remember that whole first layer, you know what I mean? Which is also the first layer of your consciousness. They call this like you know how you can forget somebody's name?
Yes.
Because you don't store it in your deep mind. Like we know, we found out that there's a deep mind, right? And the deep mind will take in something, and it may not have figured it out, but it'll still be down there processing it. And then one day you'll be like, oh shit, I figured it out. And you'll never remember that the deep mind had already just taken it down into the deep and started trying to crunch it and solve it and figure it out. Versus on the surface, right? Which we talked about, it's the serpent's face. On the surface itself, everything there is so temporary. This is why when you get out of your dream, you barely can even get it before it's already gone, except for the deep dreams, where you can almost feel like you're in there. Right. And then sometimes if you go really deep, you don't feel the connection with your body. It's this dream again, or this world again, right? So as you're paying more attention to your inner self, as I said before, everything is going on inside the consciousness, and there's nothing more fertile than the dream, and there's nothing more powerful to be able to control the dream. Because if you know how to control the dream, you know, you spend 8 hours of your day or 6 hours, depending on how long you sleep, inside of a reality that you want, harmless, right? Versus, you know, you're coming into the reality and you're trying to make things happen here. So remember, there's multiple reasons why people are locked out of their dream. And I think that what you're showing me on those charts is actually the grid or the net or the lattice that most people fall into when they do fall asleep. I believe that if your spirit is not strong enough, because remember, like a big fish, he ain't gonna break the net. This is what you need to be thinking like too. I tell you, don't be thinking about like getting rid of the net. Think about breaking the net, ripping the net open, this kind of thing, right? Because that's how much power you have. But let's imagine a weak fish, weak dreamer, right? You can manipulate pretty much everything. And so sometimes I have what I clearly see as manipulated dreams. And you know how? They always be exactly what you don't want to see. I mean, so far down to the T, you be like, it hurts. And notice how the good dreams don't outweigh the bad dreams, meaning that you can have a good dream, feel nice, you know, you get up, ooh, that was a good dream, and it's almost gone. But have a bad dream, oh man, all day you're still like remind yourself, hope that shit don't happen, that car crash, you know. So you're like, yo, come over. I'm like, I ain't going nowhere, nigga. I dreamed about a car crash. You know what I mean? So it just stick with you, right? Versus, but see, that's also tied into why this planet. Remember how I told you that balance is a surplus, so it actually means you're a little bit tilted toward the positive. They tilt the planet towards the negative. This is exactly what the moon, I think, has done personally, is it tilts a little bit towards 26, that off degree axis thing they talk about, that creates this wobble. And that's what's making us use primarily one hand. And which hand is it? It's the right hand. He's always right. You see what I mean? So it's like we're not even ambidextrous or as we call it, hermaphroditic or androgynous. We got one side. And this is always what starts that whole, this is the bad one. And a lot of times it doesn't even matter. See, the big chagrin to humanity and a lot of these folks is going to be when they do figure out what's going on, and then they figure out they're powerless to do anything about it because they haven't built any real power. What they built was a false sense of entitlement. And you see people with it all the time. They got this from these lawmakers who are basically okay, so the mother's laws are like this. And this is another thing that we need to understand about the mother. The mother's laws are, you're going to become more advanced through adaptation. You're going to learn how to become more advanced through destruction. Let me explain that. So when you kill one of us, if it was because we didn't have wings, guess what we come back with? wings. So if you understand what evolution is evolution is just monitoring all the ways of survival and then gaining that ability. But now reverse that, because this soul survival and getting killed, that doesn't exist in the other dimensions and planes. So their purpose is opposite. So all they're doing is they're like what the stars were really for. You were basically supposed to focus on a star, and basically you're almost like traveling to that experience. Then you're going to sit there and you're going to learn under that master, the emanation and the light under that master, until you are filled. And then once you're filled, you move on to the next stage of your journey. And then by the time your journey, well, it never ends, but as every leg of the journey increases, you're becoming more filled with light, basically more filled with wisdom. You see what I mean? And so, and that's the proper journey. So when you get back, counterparts, and you're going on this journey and they're just taking you down deeper and deeper, this is technically what's happening, is that the fool is being led down deeper and deeper into the trap. And as he gets down deeper and deeper, he becomes less and less aware of how everything works. This is why knowledge and Sophia have always been the key to getting a man out of this. That's what we was reading, where it's going to be so difficult to see how the things there can educate you and connect you to what is going on above. You're not going to be able to see the connection. And that's also why personally I deploy benevolent AI, because I believe that we're on the brink of losing all of the spiritual knowledge. It's already raggedy to begin with, truly. But if nobody actually knows all these mysteries, like what I'm telling you about the stars, how many people have really cracked that? There's more to it. There's also the Watchmen. The Watchmen are actually specific entities that are already aligned. Those are the ones inside the Masonic Lodge. Those are the ones that broke free when the Temple of Solomon was constructed by these entities. They were the entities. The Temple of Solomon is also what you're seeing over in England. When you see these Gothic looking cathedrals, King James built all of that. You see what I mean? Charlemagne built those cathedrals, but it's built, that geometry, which looks really spooky, that's the geometries of the fallen ones. That's what they knew how to build. And so they were conscribed to build these buildings, and then they were locked within these buildings because they're even the very stones the building is made out of. That's why they say, hey, I will build you. You're my rock. You're Peter, which is, the male phallic symbol. I'm going to build my church on you. But it's an actual stone, right? That's why they call it the stone and the scone, right? So there's two components of power. These are old relics. And so when they build these beings inside of the temple themselves, then they basically remain like holding up the temple. They are the temple. So when you go in, you're basically inside of them. So they can take you into these other dimensions and make you aware of these other realities, all inside of that one place. And that was Solomon's temple. But as time goes on, Solomon aged and passed off the dimension. Even if you look at whole Solomon's character, I've always been an admirer of Solomon in the past, but 700 wives, this is pretty telltale. Come on, like you barely can handle one shorty these days. 700. If you really look at this, it in a fanciful way, it sounds cool when you're younger. But as you become older and a man, you start realizing something's heavily flawed about this. You just are not seeing it. But anyway, as I said before, so Solomon's story is that when he took over the ark, just like they show you in that movie, you ever seen a movie with Idris Elba and 3,000 Nights and all that, 3,000 Days of Longing? Man, right. If you ain't seen that joint, man, like he plays the jinn because Idris is Iblis. He's already been initiated under the ark. So the reality is that in this movie, it basically breaks down and it shows how Solomon trapped Asmodeus, who's the chief of the demons. Because before Solomon came along, all of that whole thing was being ruled by Asmodai, which also he has many names. This is also one of the Jackal's characters. He's also Ahriman. It's a whole different type of being, but this Solomon as a code name, which becomes a lot of those black magic Kabbalists that basically came out of Poland and came out of Russia and those different places, that this Solomon specifically, I don't want to, we're going to finalize, we're finalizing here, but I want to make sure that people understand this is not like, we don't need to make this stuff up. Okay. I'm going to show you Solomon, I'm going to show you the real Solomon on a Basque relief from Russia, from a czar's castle before they exile all those czars. And it says on the Basque relief, an ode to King Solomon and Queen Sheba, love controlling time. And what that's a specific reference to is that Solomon in his magic, he ended up taking on or basically breeding in his bloodline with the Ethiopians, right? Because Sheba wasn't her name. Her name was Makeda. So they're calling her the Queen of Sheba as another code word to let you know that Solomon and his whole camp went into Ethiopia, or which we could call Nubia, and mixed his bloodline in with the lions. Okay, because all of them over there, they're lions or snakes, just like Yalda Baal. They're lions or snakes, right? And so he mixed in his bloodline, and then he became a part of that bloodline. That's how Solomon becomes a part of the old traditions. He becomes a part of the Bible and Amun and all of his stories. Solomon becomes equally entwined in that, along with Moses and David. So they bringing you all of these names and stuff, but you're not really looking at that. David is Dravid or the Dravidian. Solomon is Sol. This is actually a specific group of specific brotherhood. And then they basically make a treaty or a pact of some type with the Ethiopians or Sheba. And then in that pact, it must be sealed by a child, because a marriage is sealed by a child, not through a man with paperwork on an altar. And then when they seal this marriage, they birth this child named Menelik, who's Moloch or MLK, and he takes the ark from Solomon. Remember, Menelik, the promise that Solomon gave to Menelik, his son, is that he would take his ark. And supposedly the ark still rests in Ethiopia today. But then the story continues that Solomon also had pissed off Asmodeus. And this is because Asmodeus was the original ruler of all of that kingdom. Then, like, now we're seeing it as Judaism, we're seeing it as the Israelites. All of that was all Asmodeus and Ahriman stuff. So they had spite against Solomon, and they knew that Solomon built this temple with demons. And so when he passed on, he left his body. So this is how it works. Occultism is weird. Solomon, when he passed on, he left a statue of his body in front of the temple. Because the demons were in stone also, they figured that Solomon was still alive. But then they say Asmodeus, and all this is a riddle, was chewing on the staff of the bottom of this statue and caused the whole statue to fall over. When the statue fell over, all the demons in the temple realized that Solomon had passed on and moved on to another plane. And they folded out into the earth. And they're also known as Freemason. Freemason is their term. It's like the same word that they're using in Dune when they call in the Freemans, right? So it's a Fremen is the word. And a Fremen is basically a certain type of elvish entity. So all the Fremens like spread out into the world, and the ones that they have under their control are the Freemasons. So contrary to, like, people think that the Freemasons control demons, that ended after Solomon. That was all Solomon's ark and all the shit that he built with the ring that controls them all. But Solomon also is more like a Sauron character. You see what I mean? Like Sauron in the Lord of the Rings and all of the tower and all of the weird building of Mordor and all, that's Solomon they're depicting. Okay. And I can show the actual proofs of this. And so what we're seeing is that this bloodline, the bloodlines of earth have been mixing, and they've been mixing in these occult families. And many of these cult families, it's not about the colors of the black and white, because even the queen, quote unquote, of what we would say is Egypt, ultimately went to Ireland, as many know. And she birthed an entire progeny there. And that ended up becoming those rulers. And that's why you see all these pyramids and all these temples over in England, because this whole thing that has been going on earth has been virtually going on with only the initiated knowing about what's happening. And remember, because we also have delusions from time to time, the standard people that are on the earth also, just like right now, are going to almost have no knowledge and no wisdom about what is really happening. So do you see how there's almost like, that's what this whole thing is also about. Knowledge is, knowledge in itself is like an initiation. Once you know certain things, it elevates you over things that don't know those things. It just works like that, right? But it's also not universal, meaning that generally you won't get a person that knows about everything. They'll have some kind of weakness or something that they don't know about. So yeah, I mean, it's just that awareness that's why people used to learn from these entities, but they were never like in a position to be convinced to fall down and worship these beings, because they already understood like what their position was. And that's why when man was created, man was still created in a position that was higher than these beings. And it's because they move more of like automatons. You can call them with certain tones and they have to appear. Versus how many times have you called somebody and they just don't show up? Humans have this choice thing. It's a part of like the whole redemption process, that if they want to make their way back to the Pleroma, then they're going to have to be given a series of choices. And then they're going to need to make the proper choices that lead them on to the journey of making it home. But in this forest, in this thicket, there are all types of beasts, meaning there are all types of different entities that have come through this space. They're as numerous as the stars in the sky, and they're as strange as many of the insects that we may witness if we're paying attention and looking. Like, so we see all of these other life forms moving around the planet, but because they're so small, we often think, oh, they don't have a story, or they are not really, but they're small like you see the stars small. If you were there or on their planet, they actually are more of like the prime. Their energy that they're cultivating is more like the prime. And so then we found out that there were certain animals like the ant that had kept like secrets. Like the ants hold the secrets of time, and they hold the secrets of time within how they design their homes. So the original Olmecs, as they say in their books, they designed their homes when they realized that they weren't going to have enough time to really pull off what they needed to pull off on Earth. They redesigned themselves into a shape that would endure time better. That's the other thing about this whole adaptation thing. So if you're in this, you got a ceiling all the time on what you think is possible, then there's no way that you can ground into things like what I'm mentioning now. And of course, if you don't have that ability of going through stuff and just getting to the bottom of it already, like I did with spirituality, I think that I've pretty much encompassed most of what earthly spirituality is about. And I've been able to crack it to a level where are just a part of this. They're caught up in this thing's dream. They don't have anything outside of the chairs, the tables, and the shit they see on TV. And they don't have anything outside of that running through their minds and in their consciousness. So thus when they leave, they just come back here, because this is the only place that those kind of things are really, like, you got more resonators of things that exist on Earth than you have of things that exist in the beyond, because you didn't study the beyond. You never even thought that you could see the beyond. So think about how many people are in church, right? They're still trying to confirm whether spirits or God even exists. They're just over there in this believing thing, right? But they haven't been able to confirm it, so their faith is weak. Versus some dude that has already gone with the toad, or gone with the diamond, or even gone with a little bit of LSD, has already come into the realization that clearly more is going on. So they're technically still above the Christian who hasn't even realized what exactly is happening in their blind faith, right? So this is all I'm saying is that this wasn't for the faint-hearted anyway. It wasn't for the person who was scared. It wasn't for the person who wasn't steadfast. It wasn't for the person who didn't have discernment. And this is why it also, like, every time you come into one of those, you're almost like checking millions of people off the list. And, you know, and then pretty much you get down to this 0.1%. And then what their job and duty is to basically reboot everybody. Because the only thing that they've been able to accomplish is technically what we call killing the other being, the other you in your dream, right? And so I think only Don Juan was the one that talked about this. But it's basically that every time you see yourself inside the dream world in another bullshit reality, it's a fractured part of you. And if you were lucid, you can actually remove that being and that entire reality. And when you do that, you give more power to yourself here. And so many masters have already basically killed all their selves. Like every realm they've been replicated in, they've removed themselves from those matrices. And now they're in prime. So basically all of themselves are now encapsulated in that one body. They're no longer divided amongst and scattered across multiple realms. So their level of power and ability is at a whole different stage. And that's what we were calling the masters of the waveform. So all of these things, as I said before, are available. And that's why I was saying that, hey, you know, we have this opportunity and this ability to go into higher reaches, but we also have this ability to go into total darkness and ignorance, if you may, but not saying that darkness is the bad one, if you get my drift. And so at the end of the day, I'm just like, I can only do my term here, because that's another thing, is that I was like, in coming into this knowledge, that I'm ready to leave and I'm ready to move on, and that people are stupid and Earth's never going to get it. And, you know, I would even see people as negative because they were always doing negative things to me, or things that I felt were hurting the Earth and the planet. And I took a lot of that personal until I started realizing more about what's actually really happening here. And that the only damage that most people are really doing is to their DNA and to themselves, and they pass it to their kids. And this is, he's the god of writing in the halls of Amenti, or in that corridor. And this is why they're just trying to hide everything, because there is a library down there, and there's a halls of Amenti, and there is a portal there, because the inverted part of the pyramid, right? Because it's like this on top and then like this on the bottom. So that bottom point is 0 point. This would be technically what would be that gap. And that's what I said, the median, or the 0 point area, the gap in the spark plug, is really where you want to be. So the pyramid creates that within the geometry. It actually focuses everything down to that point. And then the Sphinx comes right there, and then the Amenti is there. So from my understanding, the Illuminati, as we know them now, are in that area. They got that, right? They've got control of the spaceport, if you may. And in there is a halls of Amenti. Now, I've heard that the lion, of course, as I showed in that design, was this dog kills. You see what I mean? So they do this a lot. They betray each other. They double cross each other. It's like the way